Margaret Chen pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Riverside Grand Hotel and immediately felt out of place. Everything around her screamed expensive. The marble floors were so polished she could see her reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Well-dressed people moved through the lobby with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to check price tags. She clutched her old leather bag a little tighter. The bag had been with her for 30 years, patched and restitched so many times that it barely resembled its original form. Inside were her reading glasses, a bottle of arthritis medication, and sheet music that had yellowed with age. Margaret was 72 years old. Her hair, now completely silver, was pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a clean but modest dress, the kind you'd find at a discount store rather than a boutique. Her hands, though, those told a different story. They were elegant, with long fingers that seemed almost too refined for someone dressed so simply. If you looked closely, you'd notice the slight swelling in her knuckles, the way she moved them carefully, like someone carrying something fragile. She approached the front desk and asked for Derek Walsh, the lounge manager. The receptionist looked her up and down, barely hiding a smirk, before picking up the phone. Margaret had seen that look before. It was the look people give you when they've already decided you don't matter. A few minutes later, a man in his early 30s strutted across the lobby. Derek Walsh was tall, fit, and wore a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His hair was styled with too much gel, and he had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was scrolling through his phone as he walked, not even bothering to look up until he was standing right in front of her. "You're the piano player?" he asked, finally glancing at her. His tone suggested he was already disappointed. "Yes, I'm here about the position," Margaret replied softly. Her voice was gentle but clear, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of somewhere far away and long ago. Derek sighed, like this meeting was already taking too much of his valuable time. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This whole piano thing wasn't my idea. The owner, Mr. Harrison, he's old school, thinks a fancy hotel needs live piano music. He made air quotes around fancy like it was a joke. But honestly, nobody cares about that stuff anymore. People want a modern vibe, you know? Good cocktails, the right playlist, ambient atmosphere." Margaret just nodded, her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response was silence. "The piano's over there," Derek continued, gesturing vaguely toward the lounge area. "It's been sitting there collecting dust for months. You'll play Thursday through Sunday, 6 to 10. Keep it quiet, keep it simple. Background music. Nothing that's going to distract people from their drinks and conversations. Think elevator music, but slightly less boring." He finally stopped scrolling and looked at her properly for the first time. His eyes traveled from her silver hair to her discount store dress to her worn shoes. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This old lady was perfect for what he needed. Someone who would take the low pay, follow orders, and not cause any trouble. Pay is minimum wage plus tips, though honestly, don't expect much in tips. "Like I said, you're basically background noise." He pulled out a printed schedule and handed it to her without ceremony. "Start Thursday, 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, and remember, keep it simple and quiet." "May I see the piano?" Margaret asked. Derek looked annoyed by the request, but he waved his hand. "Sure, whatever. It's over in the corner." Margaret walked across the lounge, her steps slow but steady. The room was beautiful, decorated in deep blues and golds with leather chairs and intimate lighting. But there, tucked away in the corner like an afterthought, sat the instrument. It was a Steinway Model D grand piano. Even from a distance, Margaret could tell it was a magnificent piece. Her heart began to beat a little faster. As she got closer, she noticed the layer of dust on its black surface, the way the bench was pushed carelessly to the side. Someone had placed a stack of cocktail menus on top of it, like it was just another piece of furniture. She carefully moved the menus aside and ran her fingers along the edge of the piano. The wood was cool and smooth under her touch. She glanced back at Derek, who was already on his phone again, and quietly lifted the keyboard cover. The keys were yellowed slightly with age, but still beautiful. Without sitting down, she pressed a single key gently. Middle C. The note rang out pure and clear, echoing through the empty lounge. Despite the neglect, the piano was still in tune, still had its voice. Something stirred in Margaret's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was like running into an old friend you thought you'd never see again. "Yeah, it's fine," Derek called out, not even looking up. "Like I said, starts Thursday." Don't bother coming in before 6. I've got enough staff to deal with already. Margaret carefully closed the keyboard cover and picked up her bag. Thank you for the opportunity, she said. Sure, whatever. Just remember, simple and quiet. That's all I need from you. Derek was already walking away, his attention fully back on his phone. As Margaret left the hotel, she paused for a moment on the sidewalk outside. The autumn air was cool against her face. She looked back at the building, at the golden light spilling from its windows, and allowed herself a small smile. What Derek Walsh didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was who she really was. How could he? That name, the one that used to appear on concert programs and vinyl records, belonged to someone from another lifetime. Someone who had performed for royalty and presidents. Someone whose recordings were still considered masterpieces by those who knew classical music. Someone who had been called a genius by critics from Vienna to Tokyo. But that was 50 years ago. Half a century of silence, of living small, of teaching children in a cramped apartment while the world forgot she ever existed. She'd made peace with that, or so she'd thought. She'd packed away that part of herself like old photographs in a shoebox. Something to remember but never revisit. Now, standing outside this expensive hotel where an arrogant young man had just hired her to play background noise, she felt something unexpected. Maybe it was the feel of those piano keys under her fingers again, even just for a moment. Maybe it was the quality of that single note still echoing in her memory. Or maybe it was the way Derek had dismissed her so completely, as if she were invisible, insignificant. She shifted her bag to her other shoulder and began the long walk to the bus stop. Her arthritis was bothering her today, making each step a small negotiation with pain. She'd need to soak her hands in warm water tonight, do her exercises, take her medication. Thursday was only 3 days away. 3 days until she sat at a piano in front of an audience again, even if that audience wasn't there to listen. 3 days until her fingers touched those keys with purpose and intention. 3 days until she played again, really played, not just the simple children's songs she taught in her living room. A bus rumbled to a stop in front of her, and Margaret climbed aboard slowly. She found a seat near the back and watched the city slide by the window. Somewhere in her mind, her fingers were already moving, already remembering, already preparing. Derek Walsh had no idea what he'd just hired, and that, Margaret thought with a quiet satisfaction, was just fine with her. For now. Thursday arrived faster than Margaret expected. She spent the 3 days preparing her hands as best she could. Warm water soaks twice a day, gentle exercises that her physical therapist had taught her, extra medication to keep the inflammation down. She even pulled out some of her old sheet music, running through pieces in her mind while her hands traced the movements in the air above her kitchen table. Her small apartment was filled with memories of music. An old upright piano stood against one wall, its wood scarred from decades of use. Photographs in cheap frames showed a younger version of herself standing next to instruments, holding bouquets, shaking hands with people in formal attire. She rarely looked at those photos anymore. They felt like pictures of someone else's life. On Thursday evening, she arrived at the hotel 15 minutes early. The lounge was starting to fill with the after-work crowd. Business people loosening their ties, tourists consulting their phones, couples on dates leaning close over candlelight. The atmosphere was buzzing with conversation and the clinking of glasses. Derek spotted her immediately and walked over with that same impatient expression. You're early. Good. Look, it's pretty busy tonight, so just keep things mellow. Nothing weird or too classical. People are here to relax, not attend a concert. Margaret nodded and made her way to the piano. She set her bag down beside the bench and carefully adjusted the seat height. The movement hurt her lower back, but she didn't let it show on her face. She'd gotten good at hiding pain over the years. She sat down and took a moment to settle herself. Her hands rested lightly on her lap as she looked at the keys. They seemed to glow slightly in the warm light of the lounge. Around her, people were talking, laughing, ordering drinks. No one was paying attention to the old woman at the piano in the corner. Taking a slow breath, Margaret lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The first touch sent a jolt through her body, like completing an electrical circuit that had been broken for too long. She began with something simple, a gentle jazz standard that she'd played 1,000 times in her life. Her fingers felt stiff at first, uncertain. The arthritis made certain movements difficult, certain stretches impossible. She had to adjust her technique, find new ways to voice the chords, make peace with limitations that hadn't existed 50 years ago. But slowly, carefully, the music began to flow. It wasn't perfect. She could hear every mistake, every place where her fingers didn't quite do what her mind commanded. But there was something there, something that muscle memory and decades of devotion couldn't completely erase. The music had a quality, a depth that came from somewhere beyond technique. A businessman at the bar glanced up briefly, then back to his drink. A woman by the window paused in her conversation for just a moment before continuing. The music was doing exactly what Derek wanted, blending into the background, filling space without demanding attention. But Margaret wasn't playing for them, not yet. She was playing for herself, relearning the weight of the keys, the voice of this particular instrument, the feeling of creating sound after so much silence. It was like learning to walk again after an injury. Every note was a small victory, every completed phrase a reason for quiet joy. She moved to her second piece, a soft ballad that required gentler touch. Her fingers were warming up now, the medication doing its work, the stiffness beginning to ease. She let herself relax into the music, let it flow through her rather than forcing it out. That's when things began to shift. The ballad had a melody that wept, that spoke of longing and memory and time passing. Margaret knew how to play those emotions because she'd lived them. Every note carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she'd given up. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, finding passages she'd forgotten she knew, executing flourishes that surprised even her. A couple near the piano stopped mid-sentence. The man's hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, paused in mid-air. The woman's eyes moved from her phone to the corner where the music was coming from. They listened for a moment, then exchanged a glance that said, "Are you hearing this?" Margaret transitioned into her third piece, something with a bit more complexity. Her fingers danced across the keys, executing runs that required precision and speed. It wasn't perfect, her left hand occasionally struggling to keep up with her right, but the heart of the music was there. The soul of it. More people were noticing now. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they got quieter. People weren't just hearing the music anymore, they were listening to it. There's a difference, and everyone in that room was beginning to feel it. Derek noticed too. He stood behind the bar, arms crossed, watching with a frown creasing his forehead. This wasn't what he wanted. People were supposed to be focused on their drinks, their dates, their business deals. They weren't supposed to be distracted by the old lady on the piano, but Margaret was lost in the music now, unaware of the watching eyes. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Her eyes were half closed, seeing something far beyond the lounge, beyond the hotel, beyond the city itself. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere she hadn't been able to visit in decades. She played a Chopin nocturne next, one of the simpler ones, but even simple Chopin requires skill and sensitivity. The melody floated through the room like smoke, curling around conversations, slipping between the clinks of glasses. It was music that spoke of nighttime and solitude, of beauty found in darkness. An elderly couple by the fireplace had stopped talking completely. The woman had her hand on her husband's arm, and they both wore expressions of wonder, like children watching snowfall for the first time. A young woman in a business suit set down her phone and just listened, her eyes growing bright with unexpected emotion. Derek couldn't stand it anymore. He marched over to the piano, his footsteps hard against the floor. Margaret, deep in her performance, didn't notice him approaching until he was standing right beside the piano. She finished the phrase she was playing and looked up at him, her hands still resting on the keys. "Too loud," Derek said, though his voice seemed loud enough to be heard across the lounge. Several guests looked over, annoyed at the interruption. "I thought I told you to keep it quiet. This is background music, remember? Background. Nobody's here for a concert." Margaret's expression didn't change. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and measured. "I'm playing at the same volume I've been playing all evening." "Well, it feels louder. Just tone it down, okay? Keep it simple. Simpler than what you're playing now." Derek turned and walked away before she could respond. Margaret watched him go, then looked back at the piano. Around her, the guests were settling back into their conversations, though several shot sympathetic looks in her direction. An older gentleman at a nearby table shook his head in disgust at Derek's rudeness. She placed her hands back on the keys and began something simpler, lighter. A straightforward melody with uncomplicated harmonies. The kind of thing you might actually hear in an elevator. But even as she played it, she couldn't help adding little touches, tiny variations that elevated it beyond mere background noise. Old habits were hard to break. The evening continued like that. Margaret played, Derek glowered from the bar, and the guests gradually split into two camps. Those who were annoyed that the piano was interrupting their conversations, and those who were increasingly captivated by the old woman in the corner, creating something beautiful. By 9 o'clock, Margaret's hands were beginning to hurt. The arthritis was making itself known, a dull ache spreading through her knuckles and wrists. She'd pushed herself harder than she should have, excited by the feeling of performing again, even in these humble circumstances. She slowed her playing, chose simpler pieces, and tried to be gentler with the keys. At 10 o'clock, her shift ended. She carefully closed the keyboard cover and slowly stood up, feeling every one of her 72 years in her joints and muscles. She packed her bag, aware that several people in the lounge were watching her. As she headed toward the exit, a man in his 50s approached her. He was well-dressed with kind eyes and graying hair. "Excuse me," he said. "I just wanted to say, that was truly lovely. You play beautifully." Margaret smiled, genuinely touched. "Thank you. That's very kind. Have you been playing long?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. "A very long time." "It shows. There's I don't know, a quality to your playing. My mother used to play piano, and you remind me of her. There's real feeling in it, you know." "Thank you," Margaret said again. "That means more than you know." She left the hotel feeling tired, but satisfied. Her hands throbbed as she walked to the bus stop, but it was a good pain, the pain of muscles used for their proper purpose after too long idle. On the bus ride home, she looked at her hands in her lap, at the swollen knuckles and age spots, and remembered when they were young and strong and perfect. That night, soaking her hands in warm water in her tiny kitchen, Margaret allowed herself to wonder, what if she pushed a little harder? What if she played something more challenging? What if, just for a moment, she stopped being the invisible old woman playing background music and became who she once was? It was a dangerous thought, the kind of thought that could lead to disappointment and heartache. But it was also exciting in a way she hadn't felt in years. As she carefully dried her hands and prepared for bed, she couldn't help smiling. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday passed in a similar pattern. Margaret played, Derek complained, guests were divided. But each night more people seemed to be listening. Each night Margaret played with a little more confidence, pushed herself a little harder. By Sunday, Derek's frustration was visible. He paced behind the bar, shot angry looks at the piano, and snapped at his staff. The lounge was too quiet during Margaret's performances. People weren't drinking enough, they were listening instead of talking. It was all wrong, but what really bothered him, though he would never admit it, was that people were coming specifically to hear her play. The front desk had received calls asking what time the pianist performed. Guests were timing their evening plans around her schedule. As Margaret packed up on Sunday night, Derek watched her with barely concealed resentment. This wasn't over. Something had to change. He just hadn't figured out what yet. 2 weeks into the job, Margaret had found her rhythm. Her hands were adjusting to the regular playing schedule, though she still needed her medications and evening soaks. She'd begun to learn the patterns of the lounge, which nights were busier, which times people were most likely to listen versus when they just wanted noise to fill the silence. Thursday and Friday brought the business crowd, people unwinding after long workdays. Saturdays attracted couples and tourists. Sundays were quieter, more intimate, with guests who seemed to genuinely appreciate live music. She adjusted her repertoire accordingly, reading the room the way experienced performers do. But Derek's mood was getting worse. The lounge had become too popular. The hotel owner, Mr. Harrison, had commented positively on the increased business. Guests were leaving 5-star reviews mentioning the wonderful pianist. His assistant manager had suggested they should advertise Margaret's performances. Derek saw all of this as a personal threat. This was his lounge, his vision, his modern aesthetic. Some old woman playing dusty classical music wasn't supposed to be the draw. It made him feel irrelevant, undermined. And Derek Walsh did not handle feeling irrelevant well. Saturday evening arrived and the lounge was packed. Every table occupied, people standing at the bar, a waiting list for seating. Derek moved through the crowd with barely contained irritation, blaming Margaret's piano playing for attracting the wrong kind of clientele, as he'd told his staff earlier. Margaret arrived at her usual time, noting the crowd with quiet surprise. She made her way to the piano, settled onto the bench, and began her evening with a gentle jazz piece. The conversations continued around her, but with an undercurrent of attention. People were here to listen, whether Derek liked it or not. She played for about 45 minutes, moving through her carefully selected repertoire. Her hands felt good tonight, the pain minimal, her fingers responding to her commands with something approaching their old agility. She allowed herself to play with more expression, more dynamics, letting the music breathe and build. During a soft passage, she noticed someone in the crowd. A woman probably in her 60s, silver-haired like Margaret, sitting alone at a corner table. The woman wasn't looking at her phone or reading. She was just listening, with tears running silently down her face. The music had touched something deep, opened some old wound or memory. Margaret saw this and played more gently, gave the music even more tenderness. This was why she'd fallen in love with piano as a child. Not for fame or recognition, but for this. The ability to reach into someone's heart and make them feel less alone. She finished the piece and transitioned to something slightly more upbeat. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, the spell breaking just enough for conversations to resume at a normal volume. That's when Derek made his move. He'd been drinking, which was against hotel policy, but Derek often made exceptions for himself. He'd been standing at the bar watching Margaret play, watching the crowd hang on every note, watching his careful vision for the lounge crumble under the weight of her talent. The alcohol hadn't improved his mood. He walked across the lounge floor with purposeful strides. Several guests sensed trouble and their conversations faltered. Margaret, focused on her playing, didn't notice him until he was standing directly beside the piano. "We need to talk," Derek announced loudly. His voice cut through the music and conversation like a knife. Right now, Margaret's hand stilled on the keys. She looked up at him calmly. Though her heart had begun to beat faster, she recognized the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, years ago, in different contexts. It was the look of someone about to be cruel because they felt small. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, there's a problem," Derek said, his voice carrying across the now silent room. Every person in the lounge had stopped what they were doing to watch. "The problem is you don't follow instructions. I told you, simple and quiet. Background music. But every night you're over here acting like this is Carnegie Hall." "I've been playing at the same volume," Margaret said, keeping her voice even. "I play what the guests seem to enjoy." "The guests?" Derek laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "The guests are here for cocktails and atmosphere. They're not here for a concert from some old piano teacher who thinks she's special." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The silver-haired woman who'd been crying looked horrified. A businessman at the bar actually stood up, as if preparing to intervene. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap now, her face calm but with something steel-like behind her eyes. "I'm simply doing the job you hired me for." "No, you're doing more than that. You're making this about you. You're disrupting the vibe, making people focus on the music instead of their conversations. This is a cocktail lounge, not a concert hall. I don't know how many times I have to explain this." Derek's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. The alcohol was making him reckless, saying things he might have kept inside if he'd been sober. "You play too loud, too complicated, too much of everything. It's distracting. It's annoying." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then simply said, "I understand." But Derek wasn't finished. He'd gone too far to back down now, and his ego demanded that he win this confrontation in front of all these witnesses. "You know what? I'm tired of this. I'm tired of coming in every day and dealing with this piano problem. My boss thinks you're great. The guests think you're great, but I know the truth. You're just an old woman playing hotel piano and everyone's acting like it's something special when it's really just ordinary." The silence in the room was absolute now. People were staring at Derek with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. His assistant manager, standing near the bar, had gone pale. Margaret sat very still. Her hands, those elegant hands with their swollen knuckles, rested quietly on her lap. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "What would you like me to do?" And that's when Derek made his fatal mistake. Emboldened by anger and alcohol, feeling like he needed to prove something to everyone watching, he decided to call what he thought was a bluff. "You know what?" he said, crossing his arms and leaning against the piano in a deliberately casual pose. "I'll make you a deal. Why don't you show everyone here what you're really capable of? Play something actually impressive, something that justifies all this attention you've been getting, something that proves you're not just wasting everyone's time with your simple little songs." He paused, looking around the room at the watching faces, feeding off the attention. "Play something that actually blows me away. Really shows what you can do. Because from where I'm standing, I don't think you've got it in you. I think you're playing basic piano music and people are being polite." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A spark of something that hadn't been there before. Derek, mistaking her silence for uncertainty, pressed his advantage. "In fact, I'm so confident that you can't do it, that this is all just hype. I'll make you a promise. If you can play something truly spectacular, something that genuinely impresses me and proves you're not just another hotel pianist, something that actually justifies all this fuss, then I'll quit. I'll quit my job right here, right now." He laughed, and it echoed uncomfortably through the silent room. "But when you can't, when you play your little songs and everyone realizes they're really not that special, then maybe you'll understand that you need to follow the rules I set. Maybe you'll understand your place." The cruelty of that last phrase hung in the air. Several people gasped. The businessman who'd stood up earlier took a step toward Derek, his face angry. But Margaret raised one hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow commanded attention. "Your place," she repeated softly, more to herself than to him. Derek, sensing what he thought was victory, smiled. "That's right. Your place is playing background music quietly without calling attention to yourself. That's what I hired you for. That's what this job is." Margaret looked down at her hands, at the way they rested on her lap. These hands that had once moved with the speed and precision of a machine, that had coaxed beauty from instruments across the world, that had been photographed and studied and celebrated. These hands that arthritis had claimed, that time had marked, that she'd thought had played their last important notes decades ago. She looked back up at Derek, and for the first time he saw something in her face that made him uncomfortable. Not anger, not hurt, but something else. A kind of quiet certainty, like someone who's just made an important decision. "As you wish," she said simply. The words were so quiet that people in the back of the crowd had to lean forward to hear them. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she sat up a little straighter, adjusted her position on the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. Derek stepped back slightly, his arms still crossed, his expression smug. He'd won. He'd put her in her place. After this, things would go back to how they should be. He had no idea what was about to happen. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and seemed to center herself. When she opened her eyes again, they were focused on the keys with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Around her, the room was silent, waiting. Her fingers settled onto the keys, finding their starting position. She paused there, letting the moment stretch out, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. 50 years. 50 years since she'd played like this in front of people. 50 years of silence, of hiding, of pretending to be less than she was. Derek had asked her to show him what she could really do. He'd challenged her to prove herself, to justify her existence, to demonstrate her worth. He'd demanded that she stop hiding and reveal herself. Careful what you wish for, Margaret thought. And then, with a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul, she began to play. The first notes rang out with a clarity and power that seemed impossible from hands that looked so fragile. Margaret had chosen a piece that would have challenged pianists half her age, a technically demanding composition that required not just skill, but decades of mastery to truly understand. It was Liszt, the kind of music that separates talented musicians from true artists. The opening passage required her hands to move across the entire keyboard with breathtaking speed, executing runs and jumps that most people couldn't even follow visually. And Margaret, this old woman with arthritis and swollen knuckles, played it perfectly. Derek's smug expression began to falter. Around the room, mouths dropped open. The businessman who'd been angry on Margaret's behalf slowly sat back down, his eyes wide. The silver-haired woman stopped crying and started staring instead, her hand covering her mouth. Margaret's entire body moved with the music now. Her torso swayed, her shoulders rose and fell, her head tilted as if she were listening to something beyond the notes themselves. The pain in her joints, the stiffness from arthritis, all of it seemed to vanish under the weight of pure muscle memory and will. The music built and built, complex chords that required her hands to stretch impossibly wide. Lightning-fast passages where her fingers became a blur on the keys. Moments of such delicate softness that people held their breath to hear them, followed by crashing fortissimos that made the crystal glasses on nearby tables vibrate. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was interpretation at the highest level. Every phrase was shaped with intention. Every dynamic change served the emotional arc of the piece. She played with the confidence of someone who'd spent thousands of hours with this music, who understood not just what notes to play but why they mattered. A woman near the front pulled out her phone and started recording. Then another person did the same. Within seconds, a dozen phones were held up, capturing this moment that everyone in the room understood was special, was rare, was something they would talk about for years. Derek had gone from red to white. The smile had completely left his face. He stood frozen beside the piano, his arms no longer crossed but hanging uselessly at his sides, watching something he couldn't quite process. This wasn't possible. Old women who played hotel piano didn't play like this. Nobody played like this. Margaret finished the Liszt piece with a flourish that made several people jump, her hands coming down on the final chord with perfect timing and weight. But she didn't stop. Without pausing, without giving anyone time to react, she transitioned seamlessly into Rachmaninoff. The new piece started soft, almost questioning, like a conversation beginning. Then it grew, became more insistent, more passionate. Her left hand executed a bass line that rumbled through the floor while her right hand sang a melody that could break your heart. The two hands moved independently but perfectly synchronized, like two people dancing who knew each other so well they didn't need to look at each other to move as one. Tears were flowing freely now, not just from the silver-haired woman but from others scattered through the crowd. The music was speaking to something universal, something that transcended age and background and circumstance. It was speaking about longing, about loss, about the way beauty and pain are often inseparable. An elderly man near the back of the room had begun to shake. His wife noticed and leaned over with concern, but he waved her away, his eyes locked on Margaret. His face had gone through shock into something else, something like recognition, like he was seeing a ghost. Margaret moved into Chopin next, a polonaise that required heroic technique and deep emotional understanding. Her fingers flew over the keys, executing passages that would have been impressive from a concert pianist in their prime, let alone a woman in her 70s who worked for minimum wage in a hotel lounge. The music was triumphant now, bold and declarative. It seemed to fill not just the room but the entire hotel, pouring out through the doors and into the lobby, drawing people from their rooms and the restaurant. Staff members appeared in doorways, frozen in place by what they were hearing. Derek had backed away from the piano now, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He was beginning to understand in a vague way that he had made a terrible mistake, but he couldn't yet grasp the full scope of it, couldn't comprehend exactly what was happening in front of him. Margaret's face was transformed. The quiet, modest expression she usually wore had been replaced by something fierce and joyful. This was who she really was, who she'd always been under the surface. This was the self she'd buried for decades, the part of her soul she'd locked away to take care of her sick husband, to survive in obscurity, to make peace with a small life. But that self had never really died. It had just been sleeping, waiting, patient as a seed in winter soil. She played for 20 minutes straight, moving through pieces that represented different eras and styles, but all demanding the highest level of artistry. Each transition was seamless, each piece building on what came before, creating a narrative arc that took the audience on a journey through the full range of human emotion. And then, as she approached what would be her final piece, the elderly man in the back finally found his voice. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and spoke words that cut through even the music. "It can't be," he said, his voice trembling. "My God, it can't be." Margaret's hands never stopped moving, but her eyes flickered toward him for just a moment. Their gazes met across the crowded room, and something passed between them. Recognition, acknowledgement, the weight of time and memory. The man walked forward through the crowd, people parting to let him through. He was distinguished-looking, with a mane of white hair and the bearing of someone used to commanding attention. His wife followed behind him, looking confused and concerned. Margaret played her final piece, a Bach prelude and fugue, that represented the pinnacle of keyboard composition. It was mathematically complex and emotionally profound, requiring the pianist to manage multiple independent melodic lines simultaneously while maintaining perfect clarity. It was the kind of piece that only true masters attempted. She played it flawlessly. When the final note died away, the silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. No one moved. No one breathed. The moment felt suspended in time, like the pause between heartbeats. Then the old man spoke again, his voice choked with emotion. "You're Margaret Chen. Not the piano teacher Margaret Chen from the phone book. You're Margaret Mei-Ling Chen. The Margaret Chen." He turned to the stunned crowd, his hands shaking. "Do you people understand what you just witnessed? Do you have any idea who this woman is?" People looked at each other, confused. The name meant nothing to most of them. But the elderly man was beside himself, tears now running down his own face. "This woman," he said, his voice gaining strength, "is one of the greatest pianists of her generation. Maybe any generation. I'm a music professor at the conservatory, been teaching for 40 years. And in my entire career I've heard maybe 3 or 4 people who could play at this level. She performed at La Scala when she was 25, the Vienna Musikverein, the Royal Albert Hall. Her recording of the Goldberg Variations is still considered definitive by scholars." He looked back at Margaret, who sat quietly at the piano, her hands resting in her lap, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. "I was at your concert in Boston in 1981. I was a graduate student. You played Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, and it changed my life. I became a music teacher because of that night, because I wanted to serve music the way you did." He moved closer to the piano. "And then you disappeared. Everyone wondered what happened. There were rumors you'd moved to Europe or that you'd died young. The music world mourned the loss of your voice. Your recordings became collector's items. Students at conservatories still study them." Margaret looked at him with tired, ancient eyes. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried through the silent room. "That was a very long time ago, Professor. A different lifetime, but why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you leave? Why did you let the world think you were gone?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Around her, the crowd hung on her silence, waiting for an answer to a mystery 5 decades old. Even Derek, pale and shaking, was listening despite himself. "My husband," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was diagnosed with early-onset dementia when I was 35. He was only 37, and he was dying slowly, day by day. He'd been a music teacher, a beautiful pianist himself. He needed me. He needed someone to care for him, to be there as he forgot who he was." She looked down at her hands. "I couldn't do both. I couldn't give concerts and recordings the attention they deserved while watching the man I loved disappear. So I made a choice. I stepped away. I let the world forget me. And I spent 20 years taking care of him until the end." The silver-haired woman who'd been crying earlier let out a soft sob. Several other people wiped their eyes. The raw honesty of Margaret's words, the sacrifice they represented, hung heavy in the air. "After he passed," Margaret continued, "I was almost 60, my hands had aged. The arthritis had started. I thought, this is fine. I had my time in the spotlight. I made my choice, and I don't regret it. I taught children in my neighborhood. I lived quietly. I made peace with being forgotten." She looked directly at Derek, who flinched under her gaze. "And then this young man hired me to play background music in his hotel lounge. And he treated me like I was invisible, worthless, just another piece of furniture. And tonight he challenged me to prove I was worth anything at all." Derek's face had gone beyond pale into a kind of gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The full weight of what he'd done, who he'd been cruel to, was crushing down on him. So I showed him, Margaret said simply. You asked to see what I could really do, now you know. The applause started slowly, one person clapping, then another, then suddenly the entire room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was the kind of ovation usually reserved for the end of symphonies, the kind that comes from witnessing something truly extraordinary. People were standing, many crying, some shouting appreciation in languages Margaret didn't even speak. The music professor was openly weeping now, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. He kept saying, "Incredible, incredible," over and over like a prayer. His wife, who'd initially looked confused, was now clapping just as hard, beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd witnessed. Through it all, Derek stood frozen. He looked like a man watching his life fall apart in real time. His promise hung in the air like smoke. If you play something spectacular, I'll quit. Those words, spoken so confidently minutes ago, now felt like a noose around his neck. Several people in the crowd were looking at him, waiting to see if he'd honor his word. His assistant manager had her hand over her mouth, looking mortified. She'd warned him to be careful, to not underestimate the old woman, but Derek never listened to anyone. He tried to speak, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish out of water. Finally, words came out, weak and desperate. I didn't mean, that was just, I was being rhetorical. You promised, someone in the crowd called out, a young man with his phone still recording. You said if she proved herself you'd quit, we all heard you, it's on video. Derek's face went through several shades of red. You can't hold me to that. I was making a point. Obviously, I didn't think. That's right, the music professor interrupted, his voice suddenly hard. You didn't think. You didn't think before you humiliated this woman. You didn't think before you challenged a legend. You didn't think she could possibly be anything more than what you decided she was. Margaret raised a hand, the gesture gentle but commanding silence. The room quieted immediately, everyone turning to look at her. She stood slowly from the piano bench, her movements careful. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was fading, and she could feel every year of her age in her bones. It's all right, she said softly. I don't need him to quit. That was never what this was about. But before anyone could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. Well, I need him to quit. Everyone turned to see Mr. Harrison, the hotel owner, standing in the doorway to the lounge. He was in his 70s, distinguished in a tailored suit, and his face was a mixture of fury and awe. In his hand was his phone, and on the screen was a video. Someone had already uploaded Margaret's performance to social media and sent it to him. I've been getting calls and messages for the last 10 minutes, Mr. Harrison said, walking into the room. People sharing a video of the most extraordinary piano performance they've ever seen, happening in my hotel. I came down to see what was going on, and I arrived to find my manager publicly humiliating the performer. He looked at Margaret with something like wonder. I knew your name sounded familiar when Derek sent me your application. Margaret Chen. But I thought, no, it couldn't be the same one. The Margaret Chen I was thinking of performed at Carnegie Hall in the 70s. She wouldn't be applying for a minimum wage job at my hotel. Mr. Harrison turned to Derek and his voice went cold. You promised to quit if she proved herself. I'm here to make sure you keep that promise. In fact, consider yourself fired. You're done. Security will escort you out. Derek's face crumbled. Mr. Harrison, please, I made a mistake. I didn't know. No, you didn't know. Because you didn't bother to find out. Because you judged this woman based on her age and her appearance and decided she wasn't worth your respect or consideration. Mr. Harrison's voice was shaking with anger. That's not how we do business here. That's not how we treat people, period. 2 security guards had appeared, and they moved toward Derek. He looked around the room desperately, as if searching for sympathy, but found only cold stares and shaking heads. He'd burned every bridge in the span of one evening. As they led him away, he tried one last time. This isn't fair. I didn't know who she was, the music professor called after him. That's exactly the problem. You should have treated her with respect regardless of who she was. And then Derek was gone, the door closing behind him. and an entire career ended by his own arrogance and cruelty. Mr. Harrison approached Margaret, who was still standing by the piano, looking tired and a bit overwhelmed. "Ms. Chen, I apologize profusely for how you were treated. If I had known, if I had realized—" "How could you have known?" Margaret said gently. "I've been nobody for 50 years. That was my choice." "Well," Mr. Harrison said, "I'd like to make you a different offer. Not as background music for the lounge, but as our featured performer. Artist in residence. 10 times your current salary, your own concert schedule, full creative control. This hotel would be honored to host your return to performing." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at the piano that had been her friend and confessor for the past weeks. "That's very generous, but I need to think about it. Tonight it was a lot." Of course, take all the time you need." Mr. Harrison gestured to the crowd. "Though I think you'll find you have an audience ready and waiting. The music." Professor approached again, more composed now but still emotional. "Ms. Chen, please, may I ask, would you consider performing at the conservatory? Our students, they need to hear playing like this. They need to understand what's possible, what music can be when it's played with a lifetime of wisdom and feeling." Other people were approaching now, pulling out business cards, making offers. A woman who worked for a classical music radio station, a man who owned a small recording studio, a concert promoter who wanted to organize a tour. Word was spreading like wildfire. The video of Margaret's performance was being shared thousands of times, bouncing across social media platforms, being discovered by music lovers around the world. Margaret felt dizzy with it all. She put a hand on the piano to steady herself, and immediately the silver-haired woman who'd been crying was there, offering her a chair, a glass of water. "Thank you," Margaret said, accepting both gratefully. She sat and sipped the water while people talked around her, making plans, discussing possibilities. She felt like she was watching it all happen to someone else, like she'd stepped outside herself and was observing from a distance. Over the next few days, Margaret's life transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The video went viral, accumulating millions of views. Music critics who thought they'd never hear her play again wrote emotional essays about the return of a legend. Young pianists discovered her old recordings and were stunned by what they heard. The conservatory concert was scheduled for 2 weeks later and sold out in 4 hours. A record label reached out about a new album. Concert halls from around the world sent invitations. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. But amid all this chaos, Margaret made careful choices. She accepted some offers and declined others. She agreed to record a new album, but only pieces she truly wanted to play. She scheduled a small concert tour, but with enough time between performances for her hands to rest and recover. She said yes to teaching master classes at the conservatory, because she remembered what it meant to learn from someone who'd truly lived with music. She kept teaching the neighborhood children too, though. That had been important to her during the quiet years, and it remained important now. On Wednesday afternoons, her small apartment was still filled with the stumbling practice of beginners, the patient repetition of scales and simple pieces. One of those children, a shy girl named Ruby who'd been studying with Margaret for 2 years, saw the video. At her next lesson, she looked at Margaret with new eyes. "You're famous," Ruby said, awed. Margaret smiled. "I was famous once, then I wasn't. Now I am again. But that doesn't change who I am or what we're doing here. Now let's work on that Beethoven piece. Your left hand is still rushing." The album, when it was released 6 months later, was called After Silence. It was a collection of pieces that Margaret had lived with for her entire life, interpreted with the depth and wisdom that only time and experience could provide. Critics called it a masterpiece. It won awards, but more importantly, it touched people. Letters arrived at the record label from listeners who'd been moved to tears, who felt seen and understood through the music, who heard in Margaret's playing the same thing she'd always tried to express.